be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the first part of, What If Issei, Rias enter Star Wars. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Phantasm of Chaos on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Go. Protect the senators. A voice cried out that he recognized as his own. You were destined to destroy me. Another spoke in a tone that could send chills down the bravest man's spine. MSTR, we can defeat him, together. His voice cried out again. Foolish boy, Sith always betray one another. A woman's voice spoke that seemed heavy and disappointed. Vader thinks he turned you. But I see your future. I see, me. An old man's voice spoke with confidence and then with confusion. At last the dark side is your ally, yet another new voice spoke that sounded more machine than anything. Will I see you again? Another woman's voice spoke, but this brought something upon him that the other lacked. Happiness. Beep beep beep. Rang out as the boy recognized it was his alarm clock. With a tried lift of his arm the teenager had thrown his arm to slap the button to the noisy machine. Forcing himself up, the teen glanced around his single apartment room, seeing everything in place from his desk and bed, to the few clothes he had in his small closet. The boy sighed as he drove himself from his bed and proceeded with dressing himself in the school uniform and grabbing a piece of toast. This boy name as you may ask was Galen Merrick, and that just about all the teen could tell you. It has been a little over a year since Galen had been found by the police on the outskirts of the countryside and brought to the city hospital. Galen had checked out fine, unless you count the amnesia, which turned out to be a bigger problem than normal. One example, his face or name wasn't registered in any public data bank. What more, besides his name, he could hardly recall anything else that made sense. So after a month in the psych ward and various therapists, Galen was let out on a clean bill of health and had spent the next 2 months living off cheap rent housing, 2-bit jobs, and to top it off, recurring dreams with no visions, just voices. However, Galen had eventually steadied himself financially to keep up with basic needs, but also attend school at Ku Academy, a top-of-its-class school, through an unknown invitation. Galen was interviewed by the heads of the school, but while they did not give him a clear reason for the sudden interest, he nevertheless accepted the offer. Within minutes of walking distance, Galen had arrived at the bridge stood over the river near the school in time to see an angry mob of girls chasing 3 of the handful of boys attending the academy known simply as the Perverted Trio. Galen didn't know the boys personally, but from what he heard through the grapevine, those 3 attended the school the moment they heard that an all-girls school was being co-ed. It didn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together from there. Galen turned his head when he heard the girls squealing at another boy walking on the campus ground, Kiba Yudo. Unlike the Perverted Trio, Kiba was well-liked and beloved by the female peers, as if his slim figure and blonde hair wasn't enough to cement the facts, he carried a polite and kind attitude that automatically won the girls' hearts. Galen was in a bind with said females himself, his preserved loner demeanor as well as they characterized hot figure that consisted of a slim but strangely fit form and a nearly shaved head with short brown hair, made him more liked than the Perverted Trio. Galen's day proceeded as usual, same classes with long lectures, same dining experience in the cafeteria, the same glares and hateful sneers from the Perverted Trio, and above all, the same wonder when he looked upon a certain classmate. Rias Gremory, the school's #1 beauty, and for good reason too. Not only was the girl gifted with a dynamite figure that most fashion model didn't possess, but with long crimson red hair and eyes you could just stare into for hours upon hours and never know otherwise. However, it was not the beauty that intrigued Galen Merrick. No, while others saw a forbidden fruit they wished to claim, Galen felt a potent presence contained within her that made his senses buzz. He couldn't describe it well enough. However, Galen only ever glanced at Rias Gremory at times that she was in his line of sight. They never communicated and the shaved-haired boy never took it upon himself to speak with her. The red-hair princess presence wasn't Galen's only question in the world, no, the bigger question that haunted him night and day was simple, and all the more complex. Who am I? The boy questioned as he looked into the water under the bridge. School clubhouse. At the old schoolhouse, now converted into the occult clubhouse, Rias Gremory herself had a chess piece board in front of her and her friend Akino Himejima. Much like herself, Akino was revered by the school students as a beauty beyond comprehension, with long raven hair, a bombshell of a body structure that even surpassed Ria's, and an expression on her face that never seemed to waver from happiness. A fool would associate her with anything repulsive. However, while the two were playing their chess game, Akino noticed a distracted tone on the president of the occult club's face. Something on your mind, Rias? Akino asked out of curiosity as she moved her pawn to corner the bishop. Rias looked up to acknowledge she heard the question and said, nothing important, thinking about the last boy that transferred here. Akino thought for a second about the boys that recently transferred to Ku and then it clicked. Oh, Galen Merrick, she asked and received a nod in return, what about him? At first, Rias was silent to collect her thought and then said, there's just something about him that strikes me as odd. Akino giggled as a funny thought preyed on that statement, oh my, is the Crimson Ruin Princess falling for the only boy who's not ogling her? Rias brushed the tease aside and moved her chess piece on the board. Then muttered, checkmate, as she got off from the couch and walked towards the clubhouse shower. While the hot water poured from the shower head, Rias continued thinking about the boy she had been seeing. True to her vice president word, he didn't stare at her with lust that she was all too used to, but instead he looked at her like he was bewildered at her presence. However, that was only an unnecessary concern of hers. The more pressing matter was his power that she easily sensed. At first it was assumed a special form of sacred gear, but the presence of the energy seemed to carry some unique property that was more foreign to her than anything. A stray thought suggested it was holy, but that was dismissed knowing her father or brother would never allow anyone associated with the church attend this school. There was nevertheless so much to ponder about this boy. The next day. Like many other weekends, Galen had forced himself to work double shifts and still managed to complete his school assignments. Galen had found a niche at the local mechanics repairing cars despite his young age. With a simple tinker, Galen manages to decipher any motor problems, marking him by his bosses as a prodigy and cementing his job, although under the table. Galen was just a block away from the garage when he heard, hello, turning around to see girl dressed up in something that looked like a skimpy bat costume holding a brown paper bag around her left arm while her right hand held a piece of paper. Take one please. The woman said as she handed the paper over to Galen and walked off without another word. The shaved-haired boy looked at the flyer that had a particular symbol on it with a single line of text that said, your wish will be granted. Galen merely shrugged his shoulder as he pocketed the flyer and headed into the shop. Galen had finished up the day with 1 same-day fixes and 3 oil changes, earning him enough money to cover a week of groceries, and finish up his monthly rent payment. He walked out the door of the shop and proceeded to make a beeline back home, willing to wait until tomorrow to get some food. Cutting through the park, Galen had stopped in his tracks when he noticed a young woman standing before him wearing the same uniform as his school, with her head down and a nervous presence surrounding her figure. The girl begun to try and mutter something, but Galen beat her to the punch. Can I help you? He asked softly. The girl's face brightened as red as an apple, but she still managed to say, I am Yuma Amano of class 4A. Galen nodded, signaling her to continue. I was just wondering, well, Yuma continued to try and breath as she spoke, will you go out with me? She blurted out she almost shouted across the park. Galen was mildly stunned. While he had been invited on numerous dates, he had rejected all of them with the same excuse. Taking a deep breath, already knowing this would be difficult, he said, "I'm sorry, but I can't." He spoke trying his best to be gentle. "I just don't have enough money to show you a good time." He explained, but after noting Yuma's eyes watering up, Galen tried to steady himself. "I understand," Yuma said with a saddened tone that made Galen completely guilt-ridden. Before he could say anything, Yuma beat him to the punch. "But can I still ask you something?" "Yes." Galen spoke, hoping to ease the pain he caused. Yuma then formed a menacing grin on her face and said, "Would you die for me?" Galen's eye widened in shock by not only the request, but how the teenager before him cloths burned off her body and her form seemed to shift into a figure belonging to an adult with a skimpy S&M uniform doing a poor job covering her private areas. The most shocking feature were a pair of pitch-black wings that were attached to her back. Yuma stood fully transformed for a moment, taking delight from the shocked expression on her victim's face, then held out her hand to form her light spear and quickly flung it at him. Galen saw the weapon being flung at him and he quickly moved to his left to avoid, but got nicked on the gut. Pausing for a moment to grasp the wound cost him as Yuma threw another spear at him and nailed him dead in the abdominals. The blow caused Galen to collapse on his back as he instinctively covered the hole in his body. Galen felt the blood rushing out of his body and heard his murderer speak, "Sorry about this." Though her voice betrayed her sincerity. "Don't think I'm killing you because you rejected me, you're just too much of a threat to be left alone." "Threat?" Galen thought, noticing his voice failing him. Yuma continued to smirk as she spread her wings out and said, "If you're going to blame anyone, blame God for bestowing you with your sacred gears." What the hell is she talking about? Galen thought when he heard Yuma's wing flapped away until only silence kept the dying boy company. No. Galen thought to himself as more blood spewed out for the gaping hole in his body and the deep slash in his sides. This can't be the end. He thought more desperately. His vision started to darken as he continued think I don't want to die. Then a crimson light began to shine in his fading vision and he heard another woman's voice. "If that is your wish it shall be granted." The voice called out that seemed familiar. "All I ask that you be reborn under the house of Gremory, as a servant of Rias Gremory." What? Galen thought as he finally slipped into darkness. Next morning. Beep. 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 The very sound that widened Galen's eyes. Raising up from his bed to see his normal room with his alarm clock still ringing. Then the shaved-haired boy looked down at his stomach to see his abdominals fine. However, Galen heard a low to his side and turned in the direction of the noise to see none other than Rias Gremory in all her naked glory. Literally. Gah! Galen yelped in surprise as he backed away in shocked, only to fall off the bed and nail the floor with a loud thud. The shock disturbed the crimson-hair beauty's sleep and she woke up stretching and groaning. Galen was still shocked at the scene, but a brilliant blush covered his face when the girl sat straight up allowing her full figure to show. Groaning a little while stretching herself, she opened her eyes to see Galen on the floor naked as her. Straighten herself up, she said, "Good morning." With a smile as she continued to glance down at the boy. Galen inadvertently followed her gaze and realized that he was as naked as she was. "Gah!" he yelped as he quickly grabbed the edge of the bed sheet to cover himself from the waist down. Who, what, why? Galen tried to mouth off a question, but the whole situation just seemed to knock him from his equilibrium. Rias merely giggled and then said, "Don't you recognize me?" "Well. Yes, but..." Galen continued to mouth out in a tone belonging to an idiot. Rias smiled and decided to stop beating around the bush, then allow me to reintroduce myself. I'm Rias Gremory, next head of the House of Gremory, a devil family. She spoke casual despite the shock that appeared on Galen's face. Devil? Galen thought, now wondering is he still dreaming. And you are the newest member of my peerage. In other words, you belong to me, Galen Merrick. Rias added with a sly predatory grin. What, was the only thing Galen could say after his unexpected visitor made her statement. As I said. Rias spoke as she got out of bed and moved to a pile of cloths that were placed on Galen's desk. Owner of said desk spun away from the scene of a NDE girl in his apartment with a deep red blush coating his face. Rias could only glance at the corner of her eye and lightly giggle of the reaction the loner of her school. How cute. The redhead bombshell thought as she slipped on her undergarments. Rias twisted her head slightly to her classmate and said, "Could you help me with my BR?" He indicated the black strap that were left unfastened. Galen's mind was in a rut when he heard such a request from an undeniable appealing woman. Desperate to find some way to divert himself from these uncomfortable feelings that were swelling up inside him. The answer came to him as he recalled what his guest said to him a few minutes ago. Wait. Galen called to Rias with his back still turned, "You said you were part of a devil family?" Rias only playfully rolled her eyes as her newest servant showed defiant through his shyness. Yes. I'm part of the Gremory family, and as of last night, so are you. She explained, but deliberate left a cliffhanger in her statement to keep her newest servant interested. Galen's mind was running a mile a minute as he tried to decide what his next question should be. The said questions ranged from this girl being a devil, what did she mean by devil family, why was she sleeping in his apartment, naked? I just had to think about that. Galen shouted at himself as his blush deepened. Why are you here naked? Galen blurted out. CRP, he shouted to himself again after realizing what he said, grasping his skull in frustration. Rias giggled as she read into her newest servant's reaction. You took a pretty bad hit last night, so I slept beside you so my magic could heal you. Last night? Galen asked, breaking out of his shyness to process that sentence. Then in an instant Galen remembered that girl with jet black wings, stabbing him in the gut with that spear of her. It took a little out of me. Rias called out, getting Galen's attention. But you should be all fixed up. She then said with a mischievous grin on her face, you still haven't helped me with my BR yet. Galen rushed to his feet as he yelped, sorry, walking over to the red-headed beauty with intimidation almost overwhelming him. He managed to grab onto the two straps of the black BR and clip them together, then naturally scoot away out of fear of doing something perverted and offending his guest. Rias smiled and finished dressing herself. If you don't hurry up and get dressed yourself, we'll be late for school. Galen could only watch as his fully dressed guest left the room, closing the door behind her. Letting out a frustrated sigh, the loner began to dress himself with his school uniform and walked out his bedroom to see his guest nosing around the kitchen cabinets, more than likely looking for breakfast. Galen, regaining his composure after banishing his embarrassment from his earlier encounter, spoke up, the cereal in the top cupboard if that's what you're looking for. He walked over to the fridge to grab the milk. Rias, following her servant's directions, found the cereal in the cupboard, but noticed how light the box felt. Opened the box, she saw the container had only about enough to serve one person. The redhead turned to Galen with a look on her face. Galen, reading the girl's face, answered, you can have it. He moved to another cabinet to grab a bowl for his guest. After pulling the bowl out from the cabinet, Rias shouted, I can't do that. Galen waved his hand to calm her down, don't worry about it. I was going to go grocery shopping after school anyway. He explained, hoping that would ease the tension. Rias shook her head and said, how about this, we'll share. After all, there's enough for the both of us. She shook the box, the emphasis her point. The loner, not wishing to escalate the disagreement further, submitted and grabbed a second bowl and brought the bowls and milk to the table. Sitting down, Rias poured the contents of cereal into both bowls and Galen did the same with the milk. Grabbing the spoons, both occupants ate the light breakfast without another word. Galen tried his best to keep his composure, but the presence of his guest threw him off his game. Not because his unexpected guest was a girl and slept naked next to him all night, though that did provoke a blush, but the sensation he had practically smelled off the woman. Rias noticed the blush and asked, "Something on your mind?" Galen snapped out of his current thoughts and directed his questions to her. "What happened last night? You were attacked by a fallen angel disguising herself as one of the students from our school." Rias explained. "She managed to get a couple shots before I arrived to help you." "How did you know?" Galen asked, but his guest cut him off by saying, "I'll explain everything to you after school." Rias then stood up from the table, picking up her empty bowl and headed towards the sink. "I'm sorry for cutting things short, but it's almost time for school." Galen looked over at the clock and realized his guest was telling the truth. Hopping out of his seat and shuffling into his room, the shaved-head child collected his thing and met his upperclassmen at the front door. The pair walked out of the 2-story apartment complex and walked a short distance to the academy. When they reached the school and all the arriving students saw the duo, word started flying that Galen desperately tried his best to ignore. "Why is Rias Gremory walking with Galen Merrick?" The boy caught out of the corner of his ear, one of the many girls in the schoolyard talking. "Is Galen blushing?" Another voice rang out, "Oh, he looks so adorable. They look so adorable." The attention was starting to make Galen feel rather bashful, but he did his best to remain composed and stoic throughout the chatter, with only mild success. Rias turned around and saw her companion trying to cope with all the hawks watching him. Just too cute to see a proclaimed loner of the school reveal himself to just intensely shy. "I'll meet you after school, okay?" Rias informed her new friend. Galen nodded, knowing he didn't have enough time for this girl to answer any of his questions, and he possessed a lot of questions. So both students departed from each other's company, but as soon as Galen took 5 feet from his previous location, he was swarmed by a pack of girls all starry-eyed and mouths open. The boy was bombarded by a series of questions that were incoherent at best due to the questions being fired at once. Galen managed to wrestle himself away from the crowd and took off towards his first PRD classroom. Catching his breath, Galen proceeded to his desk to try and think about everything that just happened. However, as soon as the boy closed his eyes to ponder, something slammed against his desk that shook him back to reality, and in front of him stood the perverted trio with an angry expression dressing their face. "Hey pretty boy." The brown-haired boy called out, "How about filling us in on a thing or two?" He spoke with a tone that seemed desperate to stay even. "What?" Galen spoke, still aggravated about this morning run-in with the female population. "Why were you walking with Rias this morning, and why did she look happier than normal?" Another boy with a shaved head asked with an equal amount of rage contained in him as his 2 companions. Galen, not wishing to expose anything until he got the whole story himself, decided to lie and said, "We met up on our way to school, nothing more." The 3 boys were noted satisfied with the answer and pressed on, "But why did she look happier than normal when you were around her?" The brown-haired child once again asked. "I don't know, all right." Galen shouted at the trio, jumping from his seat to stand eye level with the 3 boys. Before any more words were thrown, the classroom teacher showed up and spotted the 4 boy and called out, "Mr. Hayadu, Mr. Motohama, Mr. Matsuda, class is about to start, so I suggest you get to your appropriate classrooms immediately." "Yes, sir." All 3 boys obeyed the order and returned to their classroom without complaint, but vowing to finish this investigation after school. Galen sat back down, finally feeling his temper flaring up. He took deep breaths to calm himself. Classes ended relatively quickly for the shaved-head student, mainly due to his excitement meeting Rias and getting a proper explanation from the school beauty. Getting up from his desk, he heard a voice call out in the room, "Mr. Merrick." The said boy turned to see Kiba Yuto at the doorway waving to him. "Rias sent to pick you up." Galen nodded and his blonde guide began to walk down the hallway. Both boys traveled to the across the campus ground to the old schoolhouse that was hidden behind a light patch of trees. Once inside, Galen took note how the presence within the structure seemed to have the same properties that he sensed from the Crimson Hair School's idol. "Here we are. Welcome to the Occult Research Club. Kiba introduced the newcomer to the room that was furnished with 2 well-kept couches, a fine desk, and lit with dozens of candles, for the curtains were closed. Galen then took notice of a younger teenage girl sitting on the couch, with a cat pin in her silver hair, a middle school uniform, and a small saucer of chocolate in her hand that she was casually munching. Kiba motioned his hand towards the middle schooler and said, "This is Kaneko Tenju, the youngest member of our club." Kaneko finally tore herself away from the candy to notice the 2 newcomers, and nodded in acknowledgement. "Hello." Galen responded back, "I'm Galen Merrick." He held out his hand to greet the junior student, only for Kaneko to retract her sweets away and give out a glare in return. Galen was little shocked at this, but managed to say, "I'm not going to take your candy." "Oh, don't mind her." A new voice rang out, and Galen turned to see someone standing by the doorway that he recognized as Akino Himejima. "She just a little shy with new people," the school beauty explained. "Oh, where are my manners?" The school idol gave a slight bow and said, "I'm Akino Himejima, vice president of the Occult Research Club." Galen returned the gesture with a similar introduction, "I'm Galen Merrick of Class 3C, he spoke with a bow, trying to keep himself from focusing on his upperclassman's CHST. Akino took note and simply giggled. The newcomer retracted himself from the position and glanced around the room when he heard the sound of running water. Focusing where the noise was originating from, he then noticed behind a white sheet a silhouette of a woman. "Akino, could you grab me a towel?" The woman behind the curtain, Galen recognized as Rias Gremory. "Right away." Akino obliged to the order and not only brought a towel, but a school uniform and undergarments as well. The black-haired beauty placed the cloths behind the curtain and backed away to give her MSTRS some privacy. While Rias dried off, she decided to greet the newcomer, "Thanks for showing up on such short notice. Sorry I can't greet you properly, but I didn't get a chance to shower this morning." "That's all right," Galen said, assuring his host he wasn't bothered by the request while turning away from the silhouette. When the shaved-head teen heard the curtain rustle, he turned to Rias, fully dressed and drying off her long crimson hair with her towel. "Thanks for waiting for me." Rias spoke to the clubhouse full of students. "And let me be the first to welcome you to the Occult Research Club, Galen Merrick." Galen was little taken back by the greeting, but regained his composure to say, Thank you." Rias continued, "However, the club is just a front to cover up our activity." Seeing the confused look on the newest member of her circle, she elaborated, "You see, I'm not the only devil in the school." The crimson hair beauty emphasized her statement by unleashing her jet black at wings from her back. The remaining 3 occupants followed her example and revealed their own set of wings. Galen stepped backwards in surprise by the display, then looked behind him as he felt a strange sensation and turned his head to see his own set of wings appearing on his back. "You're in the presence of other devils." Rias begun to explain the reaction, "It's only natural your own dark side would shine." "Dark side?" Galen questioned, but as soon as the word were registered a painful head ACH began to erupt, making kneel down on his knees, while grasp his head to try and soothe the pain. "You were weak when I found you. But now, your hatred has become you strength. At last the dark side is your ally." A voice called out in Galen's mind as his head throbbed in pain. Everyone in the clubhouse huddled around the newest member of the household in concern with Rias actually kneeling down. "Are you all right?" she asked with a mild panic dressing her voice. Galen managed to push through his pain to answer his host, "Yeah, I'm fine." Though the look on everyone's face told him they weren't convinced. Galen managed to life himself onto his feet, but Rias grabbed onto his arms and guided him to the sofa. "Thank you," Galen muttered out as he kept massaging his head. He looked up to see everyone looking down at his, ready to help any way they could. Galen, tired of the pity, then said, "I'm fine, it's just a headache." "You get those thing a lot?" Akino asked, still on call and waiting to help. Galen waved his spar hand and said, "It's nothing," hoping everyone would drop the subject. Looking up and seeing the concern painting their face told him that wasn't going to happen. You were saying something about devils. Galen spoke up, hoping to change the subject. Rias decided to pick where she left off, but still keeping this incident on file. As I was saying. The crimson-haired student continued, you recall the girl who was trying to kill you last night? When she received a nod from her fellow classmate, she continued. She what you call a fallen angel, a former servant of God who fell after giving in to their wicked longing. Though corrupt, they still seek to continue their service by kill devils like us. Plus, with the pure angels still serving God, we're in a three-way standoff between the factions. Rias paused for a minute to allow her guest to take in all this information. Though the Great War ended century ago, devil kind is still trying to reclaim the numbers we originally had. One of our most popular techniques is the evil peace system. Already sensing the confusion in newest devil, she pulled out what looked like a miniature castle piece from her pocket and held it towards Galen. Pieces like this can revive anyone a devil pleases as long as the said person is compatible and willing. She elaborated, when you were dying, and unconsciously used the flyer you had to call out to me, I worked my magic and here you are, reincarnated as my newest servant, and member of the House of Gremory. Galen looked confused as he asked, flyer. Rias dug into her pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper at the shaved-headed teen recognized as the exact same flyer he got from the girl yesterday. While I couldn't intervene until she made her move, I could keep an eye on you if worst came to worst. Rias explained. When you were dying and wished you weren't, you activated this pact sealed in this flyer that allowed me to teleport to your location and save you. Galen nodded in acknowledging he understood everything he was told. However, a serious question that had eluded the conversation came to mind. That fallen angel mentioned something about a sacred gear, I think she said. Galen spoke up. Sacred gears are ancient devices that embedded themselves in the very beings of any living thing that possess no supernatural influences like devil or angel. Rias began to explain. The power these devices have can range from simple power-ups to dimension-warping weapons. Galen's eye widened at that. The very thought of having power like that at your fingertips sent a chill up his spine. Rias continued, the fallen angel probably sensed the sacred gear inside you and saw you as a threat, thus why she tried to kill you. Sitting herself down on the edge of her desk, the crimson-haired devil continued. What kind of sacred gear do I have? Galen asked the group. Let's find out. Rias suggested hopping off her desk and standing before her newest servant. These things react differently for each person, so I don't have a lot of ideas on how to summon your sacred gear. Sitting down on the sofa across from him, she continued to speak, the best way to draw out your sacred gear is to close your eyes and concentrate on your body. Galen cocked his head in confusion at the instruction. The crimson-haired devil sensing this, explained, try shutting your eyes. She paused waiting for her latest servant to follow her instructions, which the boy did. Galen relaxed himself and shut his eyes while laying his hands on his lap. Good, now raises your right hand, Rias continued and watched Galen raise said hand. While everyone watched in anticipation in what kind of sacred gear their latest comrade had, their king said, okay, now if you feel anything strange, use your willpower to bring forth that power, and it will respond in kind. Galen, with little else to go on, began to focus his mind on his right hand, but he didn't feel anything abnormal from the appendage. Sensing this frustration, Rias spoke up, just take your time. If you're not getting anything, try moving on to another piece of your body. Deciding to give it a whirl, the boy laid down his arm and shifted his concentration to his other arm. The very second he did so, not even his wildest imagination could describe what happened. Galen found himself surrounded in complete darkness, but he felt an overwhelming presence flooded his being. So you have managed to come before me. A voice boomed in the darkness that suddenly ignited with fire spreading farther that Galen could see. Flailing himself around in a state of panic, Galen caught sight of a gigantic lizard-like creature, with horns and tread carefully young one. The creature spoke with annoyance lacing its voice. I would normally be insulted being compared to a lizard. Spreading its wings in emphasis to its words. Galen's voice was lost to him as he continued to stare in awe of the crimson beast before him. I am impressed that you managed to communicate with me on your first try, considering the circumstances. The crimson beast spoke. Circumstance? Galen spoke put loud in questioning the beast. Nothing important, boy. The beast responded to the question. However, I believe we haven't been greeting properly. Galen managed to snap out of his bewilderment at the sudden request. Composing himself, the boy spoke. I'm Galen Merrick, sir. Before the crimson creature responded, the entire space both occupants stood in was shaking. What's going on? Galen spoke in a mild panic as he suddenly felt himself close his eyes. Meanwhile, Rias and her peerage all sat or stood patiently waiting for their latest member of their family to do something. After Galen shut his eyes, a small pulse blew off of the boy like a gentle breeze. After a mere minute, the shaved-head devil seemed to be lost in a meditative trace. That when everything happened. At first, everyone was oblivious to the pens that seemed to lightly rattle on the desk, but everyone's attention finally shifted when they noticed the light seemed to flicker and they glanced at the candles. To their amazement, the candles were actually floating from their pedestals. Everyone then saw the pencils and pens, along with a couple of paper weights joining the candles in the air. While all the objects were floating in the air harmlessly, they were cautious around the candles hovering. They managed to work past their fear and amazement long enough to grab the candles before they drifted into the curtains. Akino managed to reach out and grab two of the candles, but one of the rogue light stick suddenly flew in front of her. Startled, the black-haired vice principal jumped back, forgetting that coffee table behind her. Smacking the back of her legs, Akino fell backwards. "Ay!" Akino yelped in surprise as she fell. As the girl fell, Akino twirling around and reaching out on instinct, grabbing the corner of Galen's blazer, dragging the boy down with her. "Ayaha!" Galen shouted out as he snapped out of his trance and fell on top of his upperclassmen. Everyone heard the scream and then a thud, spun around to see Galen Merrick laying on top of Akino in a provocative position. Galen, after getting violent shook out of his trance, was still a little dizzy and begun trying to regain his bearings with his hands. His left hand managed to grab a hold of something soft and began to grasp it harder. A loud mmm reached Galen's ears. Finally regaining his vision, the boy looked up to see his face was inches away from Akino's blushing red face. Nervously looking down, he saw his left hand was grasping the girl's ample chest. Looking back up, he could stare at Akino, his mind flooding with thought ranging from what was he supposed to do, to what was going to be her reaction. Akino, who was no less shocked by the circumstance, managed to recover first and looked away embarrassed. "Please." She spoke with a soft tone, "It's my first time." The boy face only "Hitch." Galen cried out in embarrassment as he pushed himself off of his upperclassman and scooted away from her. "I'm so sorry." Galen apologized, trying to suppress any animosity that might arise from his actions. Akino regained her composure and managed to stand up to see her fellow servant still on the ground. Lightly brushing herself off, she said, "Don't worry about it." She went up to Galen and held out her hand. It was an accident after all. Galen still felt a little uneasy about everything, but he took the hand and was helped up off the ground. "Thanks." "You're welcome." Akino returned the gesture before leaning into Galen's and whispering in his ear, "But next time you want to do something inappropriate, ask first." Before lightly blowing into his ear, causing the boy to yelp in surprise and backing away, instinctively coving his ear. "Akino, enough teasing." Rias telling her servant off. Akino gave a light pout while whining, "But I couldn't help it." Galen then noticed at the candles and other objects on the floor. Looking up at the occupants of the old schoolhouse, he noticed each of them held a candle as well. "What happened?" the newly reincarnated devil asked everyone. "That what we want to know." Rias spoke up. 1 minute you looked like you were asleep, then the next everything was floating. She continued to stare down her newest servant, all, but demanding an explanation of some kind. Galen stood up and said, I don't know. Shaking his head he corrected himself, I mean 1 second I was trying to concentrate, then I end up in this empty space with this creature and... Okay, breathe Galen, breathe. Rias, realizing she got her servant unnecessarily excited, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and begun to lightly rub it to soothe her servant. Galen relaxed a little at the command. Looking back up at his king, who said, what happened exactly? The shaved-head boy looked back down trying to remember what exactly happened. I saw this gigantic creature. Everyone cocked their eyes at that, finally they were getting somewhere. What did this creature look like? Rias asked. Well. Galen closed his eyes trying to imagine the monster. It had red scales, horns, wings. He paused trying to think of any other details that might help. On the other hand, Rias, having heard the gist of the details, had already theorized that Galen had a dragon-type sacred gear. However, what it was and what it can do was still in the wind. Why not try summoning you sacred gear again? Rias requested. Galen calmed himself down before saying, okay. Closing his eyes once more, he tried to force the same feeling to draw out the power. His focus was broken when he felt the entire room begin to shake and snapped himself out of his task with a frustrated groan. Sorry. The newly reincarnated devil apologized for the trouble he was causing. Rias offered a gentle smile as she said, don't worry about it, sacred gears can be difficult at the best of times after all. Her words comforted his servant, we can try again tomorrow, but for now. Snapping her fingers, a red circle with various symbols appeared on the tail in the center of the two sofa. Once the flash of red light died down, Galen noticed a stack of flyers identical to the ones her received yesterday. Now let me explain what you'll do for me now that you're my servant. Rias began to speak while motioning her hands towards the stack of flyers. Devil gain their strength and wealth by loaning ourselves out to humans who would meet our price. These services range from house calls to some more extravagant jobs. Picking up a single flyer from the stack, she handed it to Galen and continued, when a potential customer holds one of these flyers, it activates a summoning spell that will transport a devil to the customer. Galen tensed at these words, preparing for some sort of task like that. Sensing this, Rias handed over a bag along with a few stack of flyers while explaining, for new reincarnated devils like yourself, we assign them menially tasks like handing out these flyers to help them break into their new life, before having them take on greater tasks like request. Galen nodded in understanding the explanation before taking the bag and the stacks of flyers. After slinging the bag over his shoulder, he turned to his new MSTR and said, is there any place specifically these flyers need to go to? Rias nodded before digging into her desk and pulling out a red and purple compass-shaped object. This will show you all the hotspot around town and a few potential locations to drop off the flyers. After giving the compass to her newest servant she said, when you've delivered all the flyers, you can go home and we'll meet back here tomorrow. Gotcha. Galen accepted the task without complaint and walked out the door with the bag slung over his shoulder. Also, Rias called out, gaining her servant's attention. There's a bike you can borrow on the side of the clubhouse. Just return it tomorrow in one piece, okay? Thank you. Galen acknowledged his appreciation before turning away from the group and continuing. Once leaving the room, Rias turned to her remaining servants. So, what do you think? She asked for their opinion on their latest comrade. Kaneko simply shrugged her shoulder. Kiba also shrugged his shoulder while saying, I'm afraid I have to reserve my judgment, given what I've seen. Turning to her queen, who held a sly grin on her face, Akino spoke, I think he just plain adorable, and there's just something about him that intrigues me. Rias went cocked-eyed at that statement in confusion, until she figured Akino was referring to the little incident with the flying objects. That's true. Rias agreed with her queen's statement. I'll have to ask my brother if there are any sacred gears matching that description. Other than that, let's all try and make him feel welcomed, okay? She added with a gentle smile towards her servants. Yes, Bucho. Everyone shouted at once. Residential district. Galen had just finished putting the last of the flyers in an apartment mailboxes, and quickly glanced on his watch to see the time was around 10 p.m. I better head home. Galen thought to himself, thinking he had enough excitement for one day. Hopping on the bike that Rias loaned him and started to ride back to his own apartment for the night. Suddenly, a stunning jolt in the back of Galen's head made the boy stop dead in his tracks. It seems you are still alive. A voice boomed out, making the newly incarnated devil to turn to see a woman with long blue hair, piercing yellow eyes, and only dressed in a dark jacket, with a pair of jet black wings popping out of her back. Galen instantly recognized this girl as one of the fallen angel like the one that attacked him yesterday. Strange, I was sure Rainier said she finished you off. The woman spoke before holding her hand, forming a light spear in her hand and throwing the weapon. Galen jumped to his side to avoid the attack. The fallen angel then noticed a small red circle with symbol decorated on the inside and recognized the seal. That seal. The fallen angel spoke in surprise, so you're a devil that belongs to the Gremory family as well. The newly reincarnated devil regained his bearing in time to see his foe form another light spear in her hand. If that's the case. The fallen angel spoke up before hold the spear over her head, preparing to throw it, then I, Calawarner, will remedy Rainier's failure, and end you devil scum. Galen jumped out of the way to avoid getting pierced by another light spear. The shaved-head devil regained his earring in time to see his self-proclaimed enemy forming another light spear and throwing it even faster than before. Out of reflex, Galen held his hand before the luminousness weapon, and he felt a strange, but familiar pulse radiating through his form. A feeling he felt earlier that day. Suddenly, the light spear ricocheted away from Galen and returned to Calawarner, who despite being momentarily shocked, dodged the attack and took to the sky thanks to her wings. The fallen angel formed another spear in her hand, but instead of throwing it like before, she chose to dive bomb her target while lunging the weapon in front of her. Galen raised his hand in front of him and sent the fallen angel flying away from him with something like a gust of wind. The blue-haired fallen angel slammed against a cement wall and crashed on the ground, leaving her disoriented. Galen looked shocked after he had realized what he had just done. Looking down at his hand, he thought, was that the sacred gear Rias was talking about? The newly reincarnated devil glanced up to see his assassin trying to raise herself to her feet, and panic began to slowly overtake him. Suddenly an idea intruded into his head. Galen glanced down at his left hand and remembered his MSTR's previous words on how to summon sacred gears. The boy decided it was now or never. Closing his eyes and tuned out the rest of the world, Galen began focusing his entire conscious on his left arm and tried to drag out the power that was supposable resting within it. Calawarner took note of her enemy's distraction and reformed her weapon and threw it this time to avoid another nasty surprise. The shaved-head teen only ignored the incoming weapon as he continued to focus on bring out his potential trump card into play, and within a fraction of a second, he exploded. A crimson aura flowed out of his body, dispelling the spear as soon as the aura of weapon made contact with one another. What? The fallen angel shouted in shock at the immense power that was growing within the devil. The power that Galen felt earlier in the clubhouse was nothing like the power he felt now. He felt everything around him, from the stone that made up the wall to the dirt beneath the concrete. He felt a vibrant pulse beating off everything around him. Galen felt his own pulse beating within him, and it felt great. No, it felt spectacular. Then the boy opened his eye, and on his left hand, he suddenly wore a red disc that covered the top half of his hand, with a green-colored jewel in the center of it, all attached to a red band that wrapped around his wrist. Shifting his vision over a bit, only to be greeted by the sight of a dumbfounded fallen angel. Noticing her black wing, and how similar they were to the other fallen angel that killed him for no reason, sparked his anger, and the sacred gear responded to the rage, by pulsing even faster. Acting on impulse, Calawarner produced 2 separate spear and threw them recklessly at her enemy. Galen, seeing both spear coming at him what appeared to be slow motion in his vantage point, ran towards the spear with no fear, dodging the first spear by thrusting himself upward. Then, while practically hovering over the second spear, grabbed it with his left hand, in midair and then twirled himself to reshoot the spear in the opposite direction, towards its creator. Calawarner, stunned by what the devil had done, did little to dodge her own attack, and despite being harshly struck, she still maintained herself in midair. Galen, now using his wings, flung himself into the fallen angel and kicked her right on her head, sending her crashing into the ground, but the devil quickly followed up by dive-bombing her, punching her directly in the fallen angel's gut. Landing on her torso caused Calawarner to cough up a decent amount of blood and even left a noticeable dent in her stomach. Galen flipped off the fallen angel and eyed her carefully to avoid any more surprise attack. As he continued to watch his would-be killer, the pain from holding onto the light spear started to shoot out into the rest of his body. Although painful, the power that seemed to be flowing inside him didn't seem to respond negatively, but his senses were acting up. He sensed pain and fear polluting the area between the 2 enemies. A buzzing in Galen's head caused the devil to grasp his cranium. As the buzzing grew, so did these voices that rang out over the noise. Pain being one of the few words that Galen could make out. Give in. A different voice whispered. Kill. Another voice joined in, adding intensity to the power he felt growing inside of him. Give in. A fourth voice shouted that caused the feeling to become a searing pain that hurt worse than the light spear. Galen knelt down in agony, trying to fight through the pain. Calawarner, after fighting off her own pain and seeing her target in his own misery, smirked at the opportunity that presented it and threw herself forward yelling, "You're mine." The devil barely reacted to the assault, but he managed to jump over her blades and reached out to grab her by her wings, and then threw her over his shoulder, slamming her against the ground. Pain once again rippled through the fallen angel, but she still managed to look up to see the devil lift his open hand over his head and brought it down onto her chest. Said devil then felt his mind shutting down and his body going to autopilot, as he continued to press his hand against his would-be killer. Then power started to flow out of his hand into the fallen angel in the form of light blue electricity, and sent the fallen angel into excoriating agony. Galen, thought out the screams and pain, continued to let the power flow out of his body into his would-be killer, ignorant to the dreadful idea he was about to kill the assassin. Because both beings were preoccupied, they did not notice the magic circles appearing behind them, with Ria's Gremory and her peerage walking out of the circle and witnessing the horrifying sight of their latest comrade torturing a fallen angel. Galen. Rias called out hoping to catch her servant's attention, only to be ignored by the devil, who was still unleashing a torrent of power she never seen or felt before. Turning to her queen, she shouted, "Aquino, try and restrain him." Who, in turn, nodded in acknowledgement. While her queen crossed her arms and begun to focus, Rias turned to her remaining servants and said, "Get ready for anything." Both Kiba and Kaneko obey the order as well by drawing their sword and raising their fists representatively. Aquino then opened her eyes and finished her spell by summoning a magic circle in front of her, that shot out light blue tendril that wrapped themselves around Galen's arms, legs and torso and forcibly ripped him off. Galen himself felt the restraint and naturally began fighting against them out of pure instinct. While Aquino continued to hold back the struggling devil, both Kiba and Kaneko jumped between Galen and the fallen angel to be sure the enemy wouldn't reveal any nasty surprises. While Galen continued to free himself, Rias carefully approached her enraged servant and shouted, "Galen." She stopped herself when the devil turned to her in response and was shocked to see his once dark brown eyes were now a sickly yellow and practically howling with rage and frustrations. Galen himself, while ignoring the world around him, continued to struggle his binding. That when he began to instinctively gather up the energy inside of him and mentally condense it, and then released it in an explosion that radiant out of his body. Rias, sensing this in the nick of time, swiftly threw up and shield in front of herself and Aquino, and behind both Kiba and Kaneko. The blast, while powerful enough to crack the magic circles, shielded everyone from the blast. Once the explosion died down, Rias dropped the shield and noticed her servant laying on the ground barely moving. Naturally, she cautiously moved towards Galen and gently turned him over on his back to see the boy calmer, if not horrible exhausted, and his eyes looking brown instead of the sickly yellow as she previously seen. Galen himself had only managed to stay awake long enough to see his red-head senior crouching over him and her other servant looking down on him with worry and fear in their eye, and quietly slipped into the darkness. Later, Galen began to feel something foreign on his back and slowly rolled himself awake to see he was back at the clubhouse surrounded by the devils he had become acquainted with. What happened? The shaved teen asked the crowd, not remembered much about the attack before he blacked out. Rias stepped forward and answered, "You were attacked by a fallen angel. We barely managed to sense it until we felt a power surge flare up." She paused herself when she saw a confused look on Galen's face. "Power surge?" the teen asked, clearing not understanding what the red-haired teen meant by that. Rias nodded and continued, "I'm assuming it had something to do with your sacred gear that you must have awakened during your fight." At those words, Galen recalled a red disc that was hoisted on his hand. "Now I remember." The teen spoke, recollecting the event out loud. "I suddenly felt stronger than before, but I—" He trailed off as he remembered the pain and fear that emitted off the fallen angel. At that he then asked a question he almost dreaded asking. What happened to the fallen angel? Galen sensed the mood in the room becoming conflicted, which only left him more confused. Rias was first to speak up. "Do you remember what happened?" she asked, hoping to ease him into the news. Galen looked down for a moment to try and recall any details. "I remember, pinning her down and she was in pain but—" His eyes widened as he now realized why everyone was so uncomfortable at the moment. He was sure that was the reason, but he still had to ask, "Did I?" He couldn't utter the words, but Rias nodding confirmed what he knew. Galen Merrick had killed the fallen angel. However, unbeknown to everyone in the clubhouse, a dark, lanky figure stood on the tree branches that hung right outside the window, quietly observing the group. Interesting. The figure thought, his attention completely focused on the shaved-headed teen. So that's what happened when a force user is combined with a dragon-type sacred gear. A buzzing noise inside his head stole the figure's attention and he saw another teen figure, outfitted with a large, dark gray armor, walking out of a cave. "Looks like I'm needed elsewhere," the figure thought, slightly disappointed to be tore away from one show to observe another. "We'll meet soon, Starkiller," the figure silently promised himself to the boy and disappointed like dust in the wind. The next day, Galen had walked to school by himself, not feeling well after hearing about killing the fallen angel last night. While Rias and the other tried to comfort him with words like he was defending himself, or things like that, Galen still felt his stomach churn at the thought of what he had done. A crash, along with a groan caught Galen's attention and turned to see a small figure dressed in a black robe with a white head dress over her head, kneeling face down on the sidewalk with her long skirt hiked up, showing her white panties to the world. Galen's felt his face blush so red, he barely heard the girl mutter, "Oh, I tripped again." Shaking his head to snapping out of the shy lustful daze, Galen ran over to the girl and offered his hand while saying, "Are you okay?" The girl managed to roll over onto her back, sat up to see Galen in his hand. "Thank you," she softly spoke after grasping the hand. Suddenly, a strong breeze rushed over Duo, causing the headdress to fly off the girl, revealing her long, flowing blonde hair, her soft pale face, and bright green eyes. Galen could only stare captivated by the girl's stunning appearance, not just because of the beauty, but also, because of the traces of familiarity that it held. Galen's eyes remained ensnared by the appearance of the young woman still laying on the ground, accidentally seeing up her skirt. Shaking his head on that note, Galen reached out for the girl's hand and said, "Are you okay?" The girl, finally coming out of her daze, reached for the hand and replied, "Yes. After grasping the hand, Galen gently pulled the girl back onto her feet and then noticed her luggage hand been forcibly opened by the fall and her cloths scattered on the ground. Now seeing her possessions fluttering on the ground, the blonde girl began to frantically reach for her cloths before another breeze lashed out. Galen, seeing the girl panic over her luggage, silently began to help the girl and began to pick up some of the cloths further away from the pair. After grabbing a shirt that was wrapped around a bush, Galen returned to the girl and said, "Here." "Oh, thank you," she said with gratitude evident in her tone. Taking the shirt and throwing it into her huge LTHR suitcase. "Do you need help with that, miss?" Galen trailed off after realizing he didn't ask the girl for her name. After gazing at the young man for a moment, the girl replied, "Oh, no but I'm grateful for your kindness, mister." The girl trailed off, apparently being caught in a similar predicament as the boy. Deciding to break the ice, Galen spoke up first by saying, "Excuse me, I'm Galen Merrick." "Oh," the girl squeaked after being caught off guard by the sudden introduction. "My name is Asia Argento." She finished with the purest smile Galen had ever seen. After the introduction, both teams began to walk and talk with each other, enjoying each other's company. "So what brings you all the way out here?" Galen asked the girl after noticing her complexing screamed-out foreigner. "Well," Asia began to explain herself, "I was actually assigned to this town's church not too long ago." Galen nodded while saying, "Oh, so you're a nun." That explained the girl's wardrobe. However, as soon as he noticed a small gold cross necklace hanging around her neck, an ache started to throb at the back of his head, causing Galen to flinch, which Asia took notice of. Tilting her head in confusion, she asked with concern evident, "Are you all right?" Composing himself, Galen answered with an assuring smile, "Yeah, I'm okay." The conversation was interrupted by a call of distress, originating from a small child in a park that looked like he scraped his knee. Asia ran over to the boy and set her luggage down. While she placed her hands over the boy's wounded knee, she said, There, it's all right." A green glow began to shine from Asia's hand and enveloped the boy's knee, and soon the bright red scratches and marks were gone and the child looked at his knee in bewilderment. Galen was stuck in the same boat as the child, given what he had just witnessed. While contemplating what the new devil just witnessed, Asia just pat the child on the head saying, "There, all better." The child merely smiled after realizing the pain from his fall was gone and looked up to the blonde nun saying, "Yes, thank you so much." The child went so far as to give Asia a hug to express his gratitude, which the nun returned. After watching the child run off waving, Asia returned to her guide looking cheerful at the deed she had just committed. "That was incredible," Galen commented while smiling. Nodding and holding her hand close to her chest, Asia smiled at the compliment and said, "Thank you, but it was a gift from God." When Galen noticed the golden cross again, the pain in the back of his head began to throb again, but this time, he was better at concealing it from the girl. After a few short minutes, the church came into view. Galen felt the searing pain return again, but this time it was so bad that it made him flinch. Deducing these pains as some sort of devil warning, Galen decided to discreetly, but regrettably leave the situation. Checking his watch, he saw it was almost time for school. Turning to the nun, Galen said, "Sorry Asia, I gotta get to school now." Asia heard this, and while she looked saddened by the departure, she understood, all right. She quickly grew a smile on her face as she said, "I hope we meet again, Galen." She released one of her hands from her bag and waved to the boy. Galen returned the gesture with his own wave, and thought, "I hope so too, Asia. Ku Academy. You are not to go near that girl again." A voice rang out in the empty stairway that was only heard by the speaker and the receiver, which was Rias Gremory and Galen Merrick. Galen naturally flinched at the tone the girl was using, but he still managed to speak up. "Why?" Rias calmed herself down by leaning on the railing of the stairway, before explaining the situation to devils. Going near holy areas like the church can be hazardous. Not only can the presence harm us, but exorcists that reside there could destroy you beyond repair. Shaping her eyes into a sharp glare, she continued her lecture, and by destroyed beyond repair, it means you'll die and never come back. Galen took a moment to absorb these facts, but before he could respond, his crimson-haired MSTR continued, not only that, but given the fact you also killed that fallen angel a couple days ago. That made Galen subconsciously flinch. I won't be surprised if that girl was disguised as a fallen angel like Yuma was. At this, Galen spoke up. I don't think that's true, he snapped. Rias, who still maintained her composure despite being caught off guard by the comeback, responded, and how would you know? She spoke, daring her servant to challenge her logic. Galen was silent for a minute, trying to collect himself from his impulsive argument. The newly reincarnated devil then said, when I was with her. Galen trailed off, trying to remember the blonde nun's presence. I didn't feel any malice or anything like that. Just because you don't sense it doesn't mean she can't turn on you. Rias interrupted with a counter. Seeing her servant looking conflicted by the conversation, she decided to end it with a warning. Galen, regardless of the girl, or her alliance, I want you to avoid her at all cost. Standing up and facing her servant, she continued, you have to keep your distance from people like her, regardless if she act nice or not, because the bottom line is, if she doesn't kill you, her superiors will. She said with a grim undertone. Galen wanted to respond, but a part of him could see the message was trying to convey to him. I understand. He responded in a low tone with his head slightly hanging. Rias nodded and turned away, but before disappearing down the stairs, she spoke up, I'll need to meet you at the clubhouse after school. There's some things I'll need to discuss with you. Her tone implied it was nothing short of an order as she disappeared down the stairs and into a hallway. Galen dreaded the tone Rias used when compared to the comforting tone she used yesterday. Suddenly, the sharp, throbbing pain ran through his skull, and Galen responded by grasping his head as voice rang out. You're still loyal to Vader, a woman's voice cried out in anger, after he branding me a traitor, and tried to kill you, you still act like his SLV. Galen recognized his voice, spoken like he was broken. After that, the pain went away, and the new devil dropped to his knee, cradling his head. Before Galen could try and ponder his latest episode, the chimes of the school bell rang out in the stairway, signaling the beginning of first PRD classes. Deciding to ponder the event after class, Galen scurried away from the scene into his assigned classroom. Although Galen managed to keep his attention to his current math teacher, he found himself drifting off into the memory surge he experienced. Once he fully digested the memory, he found himself depressed. While he couldn't make heads or tails of what the other flashbacks were saying, his latest insight seemed to tell more than what was shown. Mr. Merrick. A voice called out, that caught the boy's attention. SWNGNG, his head up to see his teacher looking directly at him with a suspicious glare in his eye. Could you please answer the problem I just put on the board? Galen only had to glance at the problem at the board before nodding and rose up from his seat to stand in front of the board. The shaved-head student managed to write down the answer, along with a reasonable formula to explain said answer. In the end, the teacher was satisfied with answer, and said, very good Mr. Merrick, but I hope you'll save the daydreaming after class. Galen nodded before saying, yes sir. And walked back to his desk, deciding to restrain himself from pondering until school was finished. Thankfully, Galen managed to focus on the task at hand until the school bell rang. The shaved-headed teen collected all of his notes and book to be packed up in his handbag and rushed out to meet his MSTR at the clubhouse. However, after arriving at the clubhouse's main room, the new devil saw that no one was inside the room. Deciding to take advantage of the unoccupied space, Galen set his bag down beside the couch and placed himself on the said furniture with his head resting on the top of the couch. Once relaxed, Galen began to recall the latest in the series of episode, which is what he called them since they lacked any visual to be called visions, he experienced earlier and tried to piece it together with his other episodes. While in his trance, the new devil failed to notice the door opening slowly. Peeking her head through the door, Akino noticed her MSTR's newest servant sitting quietly on the sofa. Upon entering the room and shutting the door, Rias Queen noticed that her junior seemed to be in a daze, seeing as he had yet to acknowledge her presence. While her mischievous side was practically crying to do a repeat of her earlier up-close and personal encounter, she decided to restrain herself to something a bit tamer. While slowly walking up to the distracted devil, Aquino bent over so her head was next to his own with a mere inch separating the two. Puckering her lips together, the black-haired vice president spoke in a low whisper, "Are you all right, my cute little junior?" She added to her stunt by lightly blowing into the ear she was speaking into. The result was just as expected as Galen released a gasping sound as he jumped off one side of the sofa to the other side. After realizing who just snuck up on him, the startled boy lightly shouted, "Aquino." After taking a second to calm himself down, Galen managed to say, "Don't sneak up on me like that." Trying his best to glare at his upperclassman as said devil was half-heartedly holding in an adorable laugh. "I'm sorry." Aquino replied between her two giggles, "But you were in such a daze, I thought it was the perfect time to pay you back for yesterday." Galen cocked as his in confusion as he said, "Yesterday?" But then his face turned bright red as he remembered accidentally grpng the girl before him. Before Galen could reply, Aquino spoke up, "And you don't need to worry about Rias being mad at you." Galen once again looked confused before realizing what the girl meant. "So you heard?" It was more of a statement than a question. Aquino nodded while still maintaining her pleasant demeanor. "She just worried about, like the rest of us." "Worried about me?" For some reason, this confused Galen more than anything. After all, Rias seemed upset. Aquino nodded and continued, "Of course silly, you've already been through more in the past couple of days than most newbie go through in months. She just trying to make sure you're not getting overwhelmed and slowly prepare you for what's coming." The double door to the clubhouse creaked open and both occupants turned to the person they were just talking about enter the room. Rias looked into the room and was surprised to see her raven-haired queen still at school. "Aquino." Rias closed the doors behind her as she continued talking, "I thought you had gone home already." Aquino, while twisting her cheerful expression to a serious one, spoke up and explained, "I just received a message from our superiors that a stray devil had been spotted within our territory. An abandoned building on the outskirts of town." "What's a stray devil?" Galen asked the group as they teleported in front of a decaying structure on the edge of town. "Stray devils." Kiba, speaking up to the newest member of the team, who Galen noted had a stealth sword attached to his hip, are servants who have deliberately lost control of themselves and flee, or even kill their MSTRs. After a moment of pause, Aquino took over the tutorial. "Ideally when this happens, devils like ourselves try to dispose of these rogues before they start causing problems. Which isn't the case now." Rias spoke up as the group approached the entrance to the building. Regrettable, everyone took a single breath of the air and they could already smell the stench of rotting corpses. They powered through this and entered the building with their guard up for any surprises the stray might have in store for the Occult Research Club. While the senior members held themselves together, Galen was visibly disturbed by the atmosphere of the area. While Rias and her servant Simple chalked it up to greenhorn experience, the new devil was actually feeling the pain and horror that still lingered in the air. "Galen." Rias called out, hoping to snap the newbie out of his trance, "What do you know of chess?" Galen tilted his head at the question, which told Rias he didn't have a clue. Rias took a deep breath before speaking up. "Chess is a game consisting of several different pieces, the king, the queen, the bishops, the knights, the rooks, and the pawns. The object of the game is to take the enemy's king using the pieces that I've mentioned." Pausing for a moment to allow Galen to absorb this information before continuing, "The evil piece system that I use to revive you is based off this game's property, and as such, I represent the king piece, holding the authority over all my other pieces." Suddenly, the atmosphere tensed up, which was followed by the youngest member of the group announcing, "It's here." True to Kaneko word, the ORC heard heavy breathing which followed up with, "That smell." A woman voice that was dressed deeply with stuffed malice. The group looked up to see the upper half of a naked, reddish-brown-haired woman, to Galen's discomfort and everyone else's disgust, looking down on the new arrivals with a gleeful leer, but she was mostly focused on the redhead leader of the group. "Visser, you wretched fiend!" Rias called out to the woman, now identified as Visser. "You have abandoned UMSTR in pursuit of your own impulsive longing." "Oh, just shut up, you little slut!" Visser interrupted the younger girl. "You're just jealous that you'll never be as powerful and appealing as me," she moaned out as the stray devil emphasized her statement by grabbing and FNDLNG her BRST. This may have distracted Galen, but not enough to miss Visser's lower body appear out of the shadow and revealing that from her hips down, her legs looked like gigantic arms, with razor-sharp claws, that were attached to some sort of abdominal-like appendage, with the end of the spine curling outward like a tail. Galen looked horrified by the appearance of the woman while the others held their ground against the deranged stray with Rias leading the charge. "Last warning, Visser." Rias shouted, "Return to UMSTR's side and face the consequences, or—" The crimson-haired devil flung her arm to the side and spoke up, "or face the wrath of the House of Gremory." Visser didn't respond to the heir of Gremory's request, but simply continued to fondle her BRST until dark red magic circles appeared right over her nipples, after which fired off some sort of liquid. Everyone instinctively dodged the greenish droplets, which hit the wall behind them, dissolving the structure. Rias and her group were unfazed by the attack, so the crimson-haired girl shouted, "Kiba." "Right," the blonde-haired boy responded by stepping forward and then vanishing from everyone's sight. Galen's eyes widened as he quickly glanced around to find his companion. He disappeared. "No, he just moving too fast for you to see right now," Rias answered. Before Galen could respond, he saw Kiba reappearing in front of Visser and returning his sword to its stealth. Once the hilt and the sword clapped against one another, Visser's arm fell off with the stray howling in pain. "In this game, Kiba Yudo represents my knight." Rias spoke up to Galen, who only continued to stare, bewildered by the show. As such, he inherited blinding speed from the evil piece. The stray devil then lunged her lower body at her stationary foe, which morphed into a gigantic mouth. However, Kiba moved at the last minute, causing the stray to missing and bite into the floor, ripping out a big chunk of the ground. Once the stray used its arms like legs to stand straight back up, Kaneko stepped towards the deformed devil, unconcerned as Visser sneered at the small girl. Then Visser once again lunged at the silver-haired child with its abdominal mouth and successfully caught her victim. Galen gasped in horror and was prepared to leap into the fray when Rhea spoke up, "Don't worry, it'll take more than that to put her down." No sooner did she say that, the makeshift jaws of the stray were forcibly opening up to reveal Kaneko holding the sides of the jaws with both hands, and while her school uniform looked torn here and there, she still looked fine. Kaneko on the other hand is empowered by the rook piece. Rias continued to explain. As such, she gains enhanced strength and durability. Gross. The saliva-covered girl muttered before hopping out of the stray devil's second mouth, landed on the ground, only to jump back at the stray and deliver a powerful kick to the normal part of the stray's otherwise abnormal figure. This blow caused the devil to stumble backward from the blow and slammed into the wall. Seeing the stray on her last leg, Rhea spoke up to her last active servant, Akino, "Finish it off." She ordered to the raven-haired beauty's delight. Although Akino walked forward calmly, with a smile planted on her face, but Galen felt something was off as his senior spoke right away MDM. Although the tone seemed normal for her, but Galen couldn't help but feel a rising emotion that sent shivers up the newbie's spine. Just as Visser was lifting herself off the ground, the vice president of ORC raised her hands up and a bright yellow volts of electricity danced between her palms. Out of the corner of his eyes, Galen spotted something twitching and spun around to see Visser's severed arm flying through the air, aiming itself at his crimson-haired senior. Galen reacted instantly by jumping in front of Rias, activating his sacred gear, and punching the appendage. The resulting contact caused the arm not only to fly away from the pair, but also break apart into several pieces. Rias, although was taken back by the surprising event, managed to say, "Thank you, Galen." She trailed off as she seemed to be trying to absorb how her new maid-servant managed such a feat. "It's nothing." Galen spoke up despite his focus being on his red gauntlet. Rias, deciding to file Galen's behavior away for later, stood back up and refocused her attention on the battlefield in front of her. "Aquino, don't hold back on that thing," Rias ordered. The black-haired girl didn't even respond to the command, if you don't count giggling, and unleashed a volley of lighting down on the stray, who began to howl in pain and angst. However, these cries seemed to spur the vice president on even more as even more lighting danced off her fingers as she said, "My oh my, you definably sound better when you're screaming like that." Before Galen could become too enchanted with Aquino's work, Rias spoke up to explain her vice president's abilities. "Aquino represents my queen, and as such she inherits a perfect combination of strength, speed and magical prowess." Galen barely heard half of what Rias said as he continued to watch Aquino relentlessly assault the clearly outclassed devil. As the raven-haired devil let loose her lighting, the girlish giggle soon became something similar to a lustful not that Galen could tell the difference of course. Rias could see Galen observing her queen performance, and while she couldn't tell if her newest servant was either admiring her queen, or downright terrified, she continued her explanation. "On a side note, she's what you might call a professional SDST." As Ria's queen continued to torture the stray, Galen could help but let his body shiver at the unrestrained power and ferocity that Aquino displayed with her lighting. Whether the boy did this out of intimidation, or as unlikely as it was, admiration was still in the air. Rias decided to settle this matter, for the sake of time, the stray devil, and her servant's case. "All right Aquino, you had your fun." The crimson-haired devil ordered her queen to stand down. Aquino folded her arms in front of her as she cancelled out her attack. "Oh." Aquino groaned out as she swung herself around letting a pout-like expression decorate her face, "But I was just getting to the good part." Rias just shook her head in mock disappointment as she stepped forward towards the stray. While looking down at the fried monstrosity in disgust, she uttered any last word viscer. The said stray devil could only move her eyes upward to face her conqueror and utter with the utmost venom, "F you beach." Rias only raised the palm of her hand and charged up her own power, which appeared in the form of a dark red flaming ball with a black hue outline, and muttered, "Checkmate," and threw the ball of power down on the stray, completely obliterating the deranged fiend. Galen could only look on as he absorbed the individual abilities that each of the group possessed. Once he was done comparing Kiba's blinding speed, Kaniko's raw strength, and Aquino and Ria's destructive power to his own, the new devil felt like questioning his own inherited talent from the appointed king of the group. "Rias." Galen called out to his pseudo-king, "What piece do I represent?" he asked while pointing to himself. "You're my pawn." Rias answered bluntly as she began to walk away from the scene with her other servants following close behind her. Galen was a little confused why his king wasn't elaborating on his abilities. "And what's that supposed to do?" he questioned his superior. However, instead of getting an answer, Rias only turned and said, while smirking, "A lesson for another day I'm afraid." Galen cocked his eyes as his expression just shouted, "Really?" Rias, having read this expression, just said, "If you're that bored, I guess we can give you something to do at the clubhouse." She placed a mischievous grin on her lips as she spoke to her eager pawn. Galen looked at the crimson-haired wonder in question, wondering what else the leader of the ORC had planned. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 2. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Phantasm of Chaos on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.